Half a year ago, Old Eagle had managed to capture an extremely unique polar bird from the far north that was extremely resistant to the cold. He had long ago learned from Wang Chong about the coming ice, so he had begun training a flock of special birds that could fly through extremely cold weather while still scouting and delivering messages. Now, the results of his training were on full display. By now, almost all of the Great Tang scouting was being done by Old Eagle's birds. Wang Zhongxi, Zhang Shogui, and Abusi frowned at Old Eagle's words, their hearts sinking. The alliance was progressing faster than they had anticipated, and this was ill news for the Great Tang. The great generals turned to Wang Chong, but when they saw the expression on his face, they froze. Wang Chong was totally unperturbed. "I see," Wang Chong indifferently replied, leaving everyone else flabbergasted. While no one was certain about the empire's situation, it was undoubtedly in bad shape. Both the imperial court and the northeastern front line would not be able to last for very long. Wang Chong should have understood this more than anyone else, so no one understood why he was so composed. "It's not fast enough or rushed enough. This bodes ill for our future operations. As for Yuzhou, the world is sealed in ice. Whether it comes to food or heat sources, they should be in a worse situation than we are. Yuzhou's formation cannot completely keep out the cold," Wang Chong said as he looked into the distance. Everyone turned pensive. This was true. While the alliance was powerful and had the Yeluo, a force that could shatter the war's equilibrium, it also had to feed many more mouths. The alliance had already been extremely lacking in food. Given their numbers, they would run out much faster than the Great Tang. Moreover, their surveillance had revealed that while the men in black had set up an enormous formation in Yuzhou that had been able to keep out most of the cold, this didn't mean that it was as warm as spring in Yuzhou. The common folk of the alliance still needed heat sources, which the alliance had not made any preparations for. One could even say that the alliance didn't even have access to heat sources. On the vast Turkic steppe, there was little that could be used to provide warmth. The alliance was probably more anxious than even the Great Tang. "So what should we do now?" Crown Prince's junior guardian Wang Zhongxi asked. Wang Zhongxi and the other great generals did not know much about the war plan. Wang Chong was the only one who knew the entire thing, but so long as Wang Chong was confident, they were certain of their victory in this battle. "There's no reason to rush. Continue with our current plans. The more it's like this, the more we can relax. The more confident we are, the more worried Yuzhou will be." Wang Chong lightly tapped his fingers against the wall, his voice brimming with confidence. This war in Yuzhou would be the last war between human empires on this continent. Step by step, Wang Chong had gradually reached his current position. Not only had the Great Tang not declined through successive disasters, it was stronger than ever before. So long as he stood here, and Lushan would never have a sliver of success. "Kree." As he was thinking, a sharp eagle cry came from overhead, this cry completely different from before. Wang Chong frowned and immediately turned to Old Eagle. "This is bad. It's a message from the Snow Eagle. It seems that something is—" Old Eagle's eyes flashed as he looked doubtfully at the sky. Old Eagle far surpassed anyone when it came to surveillance with birds. The unique bird language he had developed could convey information on an extremely detailed level. But eagles were not people and could not express themselves as easily as humans. This sound the eagle had made was one that Old Eagle had rarely heard before, and it was not part of the language he had established. Before Old Eagle could finish, a screech came from above, and the cry of the Snow Eagle came to a sudden stop. Old Eagle paled. A few moments later, Wang Chong's face turned grim in realization, and he peered into the depths of the snowstorm. Rumble. The others didn't notice anything at first, but soon, what sounded like a muffled boom of thunder began to approach the steel fortress. The sound was very faint at first, but it quickly loudened to a deafening level. A few moments later, a frenzied storm of energy shot toward them. Genesis Supreme. Wang Chong's pupils constricted, his gaze turning cold. Wang Zhongxi and the others grimaced. This energy was simply too immense, far above the great general level. It was not an attack that any of them could take. 30,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 5,000 feet. The destructive energy moved with incredible speed, and as it surged forward, it absorbed energy from the surrounding cold wave. By the time it reached the steel fortress, this ball of energy had swelled to a diameter of several thousand feet, carrying an unstoppable momentum that left all of them alarmed. Only Wang Chong maintained his composure, simply standing on the wall and showing no intent of stopping it. Finally, boom! With a massive bang, an invisible barrier stopped that destructive sphere of energy about 10 meters from the walls. With an explosion, a destructive wave of energy swept over the earth, but none of this energy was able to penetrate the barrier. On the walls, the armor of the great generals clattered, but none of them were injured. Wang Chong placed his hands behind his back and said, "Genesis Supreme, you have always called yourself a god. So are gods scoundrels that ambush others?" After a moment of silence, cold laughter came out of the snowstorm. "Impudent thing, you still dare to speak so brazenly in front of this god, not even realizing that the day of your death is near." Whoosh! As this voice rang out, energy erupted out of the storm, sweeping the wind and snow aside. Everyone focused and soon spotted the figure of Genesis Supreme, floating in the sky 1,000 feet away. He was still wearing that suit of golden divine armor, and he exuded an immense majesty that exerted great pressure on everyone besides Wang Chong. Those cold and sharp eyes were brighter than the sun, and not even the snow could obscure them. Genesis Supreme stared at Wang Chong, making no effort to conceal his killing intent. This steel fortress was much sturdier than he had expected. He had used 70% of his strength in that strike, but in the end, it had failed to shake the fortress in the slightest. After being bitten by a snake once, one would fear rope for 10 years. In the capital, Wang Chong had borrowed the power of the Xianxia formation to destroy Genesis Supreme's physical body, almost taking his soul with it. Now that he was facing another large formation, how could he dare to test it with his body? Even though this fortress did not have the Xianxia formation, Genesis Supreme did not dare to try. Who could tell if there wasn't another trap? And Wang Chong was also in the fortress, making Genesis Supreme even less inclined to be reckless. The two were in a bizarre stalemate. A pile of nonsense. The one whose death day is nearing is you. Wang Chong jeered in reply, and as everyone watched in shock, he stepped forward and left the walls. Genesis Supreme's pupils slightly constricted at this small movement, his face grimacing. This was a brazen challenge. He had never imagined that in a few months, this youth that had been about as significant as an ant would have reached this level. Wang Chong took in Genesis Supreme's reaction and mentally grinned. The times had changed, and Wang Chong had already reached a point that countless martial artists could only dream about, matching ancient existences like Genesis Supreme. Even without the protection of the formation, Wang Chong felt no fear. You might not know this, but before his death, the sage emperor left behind a slip of paper predicting the day of your death. When you escaped the capital last time, your death day hadn't come, but this time, there's no escape, Wang Chong coldly said. Wang Chong's casual comment instantly made Genesis Supreme pale, and he lost his confidence. As the leaders of the Celestial God Organization, each of the Supremes had an extremely high view of themselves. Mortal royalty and elite experts weren't worth mentioning to them. But in all these years, there had been one exception. That man was the now-deceased sage emperor, Li Tai. Li Tai had been very strong, but his schemes were even more frightening. The Celestial God Organization had attempted to kill him many times, and Li Tai had intentionally revealed flaws and weaknesses. Even though the Celestial God Organization had been on their guard against such things, they still took the bait each time, for Li Tai's plans were simply too profound. And the final result of their probes was that the Celestial God Organization lost 2 Supremes to Li Tai. Though Genesis Supreme was extremely arrogant, he still feared Li Tai. Given how cunning Li Tai was, if he had really left something for Wang Chong, the thought left Genesis Supreme extremely uneasy. Absurd. With this skill, you dare to try and deceive this god, Genesis Supreme coldly said. Humph. You can believe what you want. Rather than arguing, Wang Chong simply smiled. Though Genesis Supreme said that he didn't believe, his expression had sold him out. At times, the mouth was not in agreement with the mind. The sage emperor had fought with Genesis Supreme and his ilk his entire life. They hated him to the bone, but they also feared him to the bone. Reckless fool, attempting to flaunt your skill with words. What does it matter if this god lets you remain cocky for a few more days? Once the walls fall, you will pay a price for your arrogance. No one in this fortress will leave it alive, Genesis Supreme coldly proclaimed. Genesis Supreme shot Wang Chong a profound glance, and his body slowly began to fade into the distance until not even a wisp of his energy remained. Wang Chong watched Genesis Supreme leave, his eyes shining as countless thoughts ran through his mind. Let's go. Wang Chong turned around and quickly began to descend from the walls. The days continued to pass, and while the rest of the continent actively attempted to resist the cold, within Yuzhou, beneath Genesis Supreme's massive formation, an army was preparing for war. Rumble, lightning crackled and thunder boomed. In an area not far from the Alliance camp and beyond the range of the formation, hoofs thundered against the ground. The Yelluo were covered in thick layers of snow, but their movements were entirely unaffected, and they moved through this world of snow and ice as a fish would move through water, as if they had been designed for this world. If one observed carefully, one would be able to see cold wisps of energy flowing into their bodies. In this frigid environment, the Yelluo grew stronger with each passing moment. A stalwart and imposing Yelluo sat tall upon its horse, its eyes shining like stars as it surveyed its surroundings, seeming indescribably strange and bizarre. Ha ha ha, the method given by Genesis Supreme truly is effective. With this special equipment, how can we not defeat the Great Tang? Smug and rough laughter broke out from behind this Yelluo. Nearby, and Lushan was mounted atop an ordinary Turkic steed, elated as he felt the invisible and warm energy of laws around him. Master, this method truly is effective. If even I can enter the snowstorm with the Yelluo, the others will be able to as well. Behind in Lushan, Gao Shang was wearing a simple robe and riding upon his own horse, and his face was beaming. Unlike the soldiers in the army, Gao Shang did not practice martial arts and did not possess a very profound cultivation. But despite the fact that he was surrounded by wind and snow, Gao Shang could feel no chill on his body on this outing within Lushan. If even he could endure this frigid winter, then the soldiers would definitely be fine. They had been training with the Yelluo for several days now. This final outing was to see if this method was truly plausible or not. The energy radiated out from the Yelluo as a halo, spreading out to the other soldiers, allowing them to obtain the cold resistance of the Yelluo. It seemed that this method really did work, and from their experiments they had determined that a single Yelluo could cover 20 to 50 soldiers, and with some special equipment, 80 to 90% of the Alliance army could sortie to battle in the snowstorm. Most importantly, over this period of time, Genesis Supreme and the Divine Works Elder had managed to solve that critical flaw of the Yelluo, their inability to distinguish friend from foe. In large part, this problem was because Genesis Supreme had not granted enough authority over the Yelluo to in Lushan. Gallop, just when the pair was celebrating the experiment's success, the thundering of hooves came from behind them. A few moments later, an Imperial Martial Realm Hu general arrived, his body covered in frost and ice. Master, Venerable Genesis Supreme, has requested that Master return to base to discuss the assault on the fortress. Let's go. Sovereign and subject exchanged a glance before turning their horses around and riding back to Yuzhou territory. The main hall of the Yuzhou headquarters was packed. Osmish Kagan, Yun Geisaman, the Chitin King, and the She Queen were all present, and occupying the very central position were in Lushan and Genesis Supreme, who were seated next to each other. And Lushan was nominally the Supreme Commander, but everyone knew that Genesis Supreme was the real deciding voice. After all, he had been the one to call this conference. But at this moment, nobody cared. Their attention was entirely focused on the model fortress cast from metal in the center of the hall. The Steel Fortress. This miniature model fortress was none other than the Tang base not far to their south, the steel fortress that Wang Chong was using against the Alliance. This was their battlefield model. The metal model was intricately constructed, with all the barracks, towers, and walls almost identical to the real fortress. The Alliance had not created this model recently through scouting and observation. In truth, they had known the exact layout of the steel fortress long before this. The Celestial God Organization had sent those disguised men in black to infiltrate the Tang ranks, and they had gone undetected for a long time. In that period of time, they had copied down the interior layout of the fortress, and when they returned, they had worked with the craftsmen under the Divine Works Elder to produce a diagram from which this exquisite model had been produced. This sort of scouting mission had been as easy as blowing away dust. For a group of rigorously trained and powerful martial artists, memorization with a single glance was an extremely basic skill. Truly the work of gods. Even though he had seen it numerous times, the Khitan King still couldn't help but sigh in wonder, though it was hard to say whether it was over the craftsmanship of the Divine Works Elder's subordinates or Wang Chong's steel fortress. With this model, things will be much easier once we break through the walls. At the very least, their defensive measures will be ineffective against us. But reports from the Tang capital are saying that they plan to fight us in the complicated streets and lanes of the fortress in the final phase of this war. Cavalry were not omnipotent. As much as 3 months ago, the Alliance spies in the capital had learned that the King of Foreign Lands was intending to fight a city battle like never before, fighting in lanes and streets to deal with the Alliance soldiers. The explanation was that the power of a cavalry charge was greatly reduced in complicated streets, while infantry could exploit the terrain to their advantage. They had all taken this for an exaggerated rumor, but now that they saw the internal layout of the steel fortress, they could not rule out the possibility. We can't get careless. If it were anyone else, that would be one thing, but I'm sure all of you remember the Great Tang steel defense line, and how the Arabs reacted when those steel modules first appeared on the battlefield. And Lu Shan's words that left everyone surprised. Lord Protector General has never gotten along with that King of Foreign Lands, as if there is some deep-seated grudge between the two of you. Why are you suddenly praising him? The She Queen said, smirking. This doesn't match Lord Protector General's style. He must be killed, and even now, I have not spoken about sparing him. And Lu Shan coldly replied, completely unmoved. But killing him doesn't mean that I can underestimate him when it comes to strategy. Anyone who could erect this sort of fortress could be considered a genius deserving of everyone's respect. And in this world, no one can ever look down on a war saint. And Lu Shan glanced at the metal model, his eyes flickering. Even he couldn't help but praise Wang Chong's ability. He had to admit that many of the things Wang Chong had done were things that the people of this world had never attempted in the last several hundred years, perhaps even in the last 1,000 years. That fortress to their south was not as they had imagined, a main hall and several barracks. Different from how fortresses had been built for hundreds of years, Wang Chong had constructed an incredibly complicated base. The place was crisscrossed by defense lines, at least 200 layers set up in all directions. Moreover, these defense lines supported each other rather than standing alone. This layout meant that even if they broke through the walls, they would still have to go to great lengths to destroy the Tang army. These intersecting defense lines could also buy the Tang army critical time to engage in a strategic retreat. If he weren't seeing it with his own eyes, and Lu Shan would have never believed that someone would ever build such a complicated fortress. The mood in the hall turned strange. Hearing in Lu Shan give Wang Chong such a high evaluation, even Genesis Supreme couldn't help but subtly shoot him a glance. But even a genius is still a human, not a god, and a human is bound to make mistakes. In this battle, his fate is sealed, and Lu Shan slowly turned to Genesis Supreme and the Divine Lords attending him. And Lu Shan's final words made everyone silently curse. After all those words, in the end, and Lu Shan was just flattering Genesis Supreme. Lord Protector General, it seems like this lowly woman underestimated you. Everyone says that Lord Protector General has a proud personality, but it seems like this was an exaggeration. Lord Protector General, it seems like you're even more formidable than all of us added together, the She Queen said with a cold laugh. And Lu Shan did not take this comment to heart. There was probably no one in the northeastern countries that did not know about the She Queen's ability to make insinuations. Venerable One, what should we do now? And Lu Shan directly asked Genesis Supreme. In 7 days, we will utterly destroy that steel fortress to our south. Genesis Supreme coldly said, getting straight to the point. Everyone paled at these words. Goguryeo Emperor Yun Gaesamin hesitated before sternly saying, "But, Venerable One, the Great Tang's steel fortress is far too tall and sturdy. Ordinary siege ladders don't even reach halfway up the walls, making taking the walls a difficult venture. Moreover, in this period of time we've tried many methods to destroy the outer walls, but all of them failed. Every foot of those walls has been implanted with 10 times the number of inscriptions and formations walls normally have. As for their toughness, even precious swords and sabers can only leave a few faint scars, and this even damages the blades of the weapons. The greatest problem was not the powerful Tang soldiers, but those soaring walls. The Alliance army primarily consisted of cavalry, and not even the most formidable cavalry could fly over the walls. As for infantry, there was no empire in the world that could contend against the Great Tang's infantry. Without the walls hindering them, things would be much easier to resolve. At the very least, they would be much more confident in their chances of victory. There's no need to worry yourself. This god has made plans for everything. In 8 days, the fortress is certain to fall. Genesis Supreme indifferently said, his eyes half closed. Genesis Supreme's voice instantly silenced the hall, and everyone stared speechlessly at him. Was Genesis Supreme saying that he had already found a way to breach the walls? Everyone almost instinctively turned to An Lushan and Gao Shang. These two were rather calm, their faces unperturbed. It seemed that they had known about this beforehand. Venerable One, be at ease. We will do everything in our power to cooperate. I am confident that everyone else will do the same. Yes. And Lushan softly chuckled. Everyone was taken aback, but they quickly responded. Yes. We will naturally follow Venerable One's lead. Everyone bowed. At this point, they didn't have many choices. Without Genesis Supreme's help, the alliance would be no match for the Great Tang. Putting aside anything else, the removal of the formation around Yuzhou would instantly cause grievous losses to the alliance. They were now meat on the chopping block, and Genesis Supreme had invisibly taken control of the alliance. While this meeting was called a discussion, Genesis Supreme had really summoned them to give orders. He had no plans to discuss anything with the alliance. The meeting quickly ended, and the alliance quickly began to prepare for the battle in a few days. As the alliance got to work, the steel fortress remained calm. It appeared that the Great Tang was not at all concerned by this unprecedented Great Ice Age and the alliance army. Whoosh! Howling winds swept over the world. In the middle of the raging snowstorm, the soldiers of the alliance swiftly approached the fortress. These were master scouts carefully selected from the ranks of the alliance. They were all Imperial Martial Realm commanders, and even in this extreme cold, they could use their reserves of stellar energy to endure for at least 2 hours. The Yeluo were strong and did not fear the cold. In this weather, they were like fish in water. This should have made them the finest scouts. But in the end, the Yeluo were lifeless creatures. Even if An Lushan could control the Yeluo from a distance, his control was limited to 10 some Yeluo, which was far too few. In the end, actual humans were needed to gather intelligence. The walls of the steel fortress were so imposing that their outlines were visible even in the middle of the snowstorm. This wasn't their first time seeing these walls. 10 some days of constant scouting had made the Alliance scouts extremely familiar with them. About 8,000 feet from the fortress, a Khitan brave suddenly said, "There's no sign of activity. It seems that the king of foreign lands is prepared to use this fortress to defend to the very end. The Yeluo are simply too strong, and no human soldiers can stop them," an Eastern Turkic scout said. "The Wuxian cavalry are so strong and have defeated so many other elite cavalry forces. But in this one battle, they lost 10,000 men. If they had not made a timely retreat, they could have been completely wiped out. If I were him, I wouldn't sortie lightly either." This period of time in which all the members of the alliance had mingled had gradually caused the alliance soldiers to realize something. There was a chance that Yozhou's Yeluo simply weren't human. No human could possess this sort of fighting power, could survive even being punched through by a Tang ballista. Any martial artist who had a body of flesh and blood could not possess this ability. Moreover, their crimson eyes were cold and emotionless. Whenever they trained with them in the snowstorm, the Alliance soldiers would always shiver whenever they saw those eyes. If their superiors hadn't given orders, the Alliance soldiers might have fled a long time ago. After all, no one wanted to spend time together with a corpse. Let's go. Everyone, just make a few rounds and then return to deliver our reports, a she-warrior said. In the northeast, the various countries stood alone, but when it came to communicating with each other, there were no barriers. Excluding Gogurians, almost everyone in the region shared Turkic as a common language, even in Lushan's Yuzhou army, and Lushan had originally had many who under his command. Thus, when allying with the other countries, there was little problem when it came to communication. Gallop, with 3 members to each scout team, they began to ride toward the steel fortress's northern walls. As before, they would also need to patrol the eastern, western, and even southern walls. From the model, they knew that the Great Tang had 3 other gates. In the previous battle, Wang Zhongxi had used the western gate to get out and lead the surprise attack force against them. The Alliance had to guard against this. 8,000 feet. 7,000 feet. As they got closer and closer, the outer walls grew clearer and clearer. Everything was normal for these men, but a few moments later, they noticed something different. What's that? A she-warrior pulled his horse to a stop and looked up at the walls. The others frowned, astonishment on their faces. What could there be on the walls? They had come here many times and had never discovered anything new. Moreover, the fortress had an enormous psychic seal that prevented even psychic energy experts from gathering any information. The others felt that the she-warrior was making a fuss over nothing, but when they looked up, they were immediately struck dumb. That's fire! Through the snowstorm, they could see blazing fires atop the walls. Moreover, they could also hear roaring laughter from within the fortress, so loud that there had to be tens of thousands of people laughing. But because the winds were blowing from north to south and they were standing upwind, it was difficult to hear unless they were up close. What were they doing? They speechlessly glanced at each other. Unable to suppress their curiosity, they immediately rode up to the walls. The surging cold wave hindered the vision and judgment of master archers, serving as a cover for them. After riding another several thousand feet, they were able to smell a thick and oily fragrance in the air. This is the smell of roast pig? They're roasting pigs in the fortress. The 3 of them couldn't even remember the last time they had eaten roast pig. They would have never imagined that on this cold and frigid battlefield upon which the cold wave ran rampant, they would once more smell this nostalgic fragrance. No, not just roast pig, but roast lamb too. And they've sprinkled it with cumin. The she-warrior's nose twitched as he spoke. Compared to roast pig, they were more familiar with the scent of roast lamb. The familiar fragrance made their fingers twitch. The 3 of them quickly realized that the Great Tang was holding a feast for its army. Impossible! That can't be. I must be dreaming. How is this even possible? The Eastern Turkic warrior murmured in a daze. The 3 of them felt like they were in a dream. It was like this place wasn't a bloody battlefield, but a peaceful and friendly city. The 3 of them didn't say a word. They were seemingly entranced by the scent, their bodies involuntarily taking them toward the walls. Roar! At this moment, a bestial roar came from the fortress, causing the walls to vibrate. A hairy and savage head suddenly emerged from behind the towering walls, the eyes even larger than a man. The king ape. All 3 of the scouts instantly recognized this being. In that previous battle, the power of the king ape had branded itself into the minds of the Alliance soldiers like a nightmare. 70 to 80 of the powerful Yeluo had died to the king ape's feet, their bodies crushed into pancakes by the king ape. Those Yeluo had no opportunity to display the abilities of their undying bodies. But at this time, the king ape was paying no attention to the 3 Alliance scouts outside. Its attention was also drawn to the blazing fires on the walls. Take it! Hearty laughter rang out, and then a familiar figure seized a roast pig and threw it at the king ape. The king ape opened its bloody maw and swallowed the roast pig in one bite. It's him! The three of them were stunned. If that general on the wall wasn't Wang Chong, who else could it be? A sharp cry came from the walls. Your Highness, enemy attack. Alliance scouts have been discovered outside the walls. Atop the wall, Wang Chong was seated on the main seat and was gazing at the burning bonfire in front of him. Upon hearing that cry, he glanced over and instantly spotted the three Alliance scouts outside. Not good. Run. The three outside the walls saw Wang Chong's gaze and shivered, their souls almost fleeing their bodies as they turned their horses around and began to ride back the way they had come. The king of foreign lands was incredibly strong. So strong that not even Genesis Supreme could do anything to him. It would be different if they ran into anyone else, but if it was Wang Chong, so long as he wanted to strike, they had no chance of escaping. Let them go. Today is a feast for the troops. A day to celebrate and make merry, not draw blood. When it comes to matters of war, let them be resolved on the battlefield. Wang Chong lightly said as he drew back his gaze. At his level, Wang Chong had little interest in lowly soldiers like this. Everyone exhaled in relief upon hearing Wang Chong's words. Wang Chong was the supreme commander of the Great Tang, and his orders were absolute. Since he had spared their lives, they naturally didn't need to do anything. Seeing that the three were hesitant to leave, Wang Chong was taken aback, but he quickly understood. What? You want to eat this? Grinning, he glanced at the fire, tore a leg off a roasting lamb, and threw it over. Though we are at war, emissaries are not to be executed. This lamb leg is for you. After throwing out the lamb leg, Wang Chong withdrew his gaze. He calmly gazed at the fire, smiling as the soldiers drank and ate. Outside the walls, the three Alliance scouts had complicated expressions as a struggle took place in their minds. On one hand, they were enemies at war. But on the other hand, it had been a long time since they had tasted gourmet food, before the first blizzard of the cold wave. Compared to the whole roast lambs and pigs the Tang were feasting on, the rations the Alliance had might as well have been blocks of stone. If not for this, the three of them would have never been so easily lured over by the food of their enemies. After a brief moment of hesitation, they came forward. It was just one lamb leg. So long as none of them mentioned it, nobody would know. But a moment later, their faces froze. When Wang Chong had thrown the lamb leg from the wall, it had still been piping hot, yellow and tender. But only a few moments after being thrown from the wall, it had been frozen solid and covered in white frost, becoming as hard as rock. Their faces shifted between green and white. On the wall, Wang Chong was completely unperturbed. With the entire world frozen over, the only reason Wang Chong was able to roast pigs and lambs on the wall was that he had designed the fortress to have many areas with small formations that could draw energy from under the ground to resist the cold. In the range of these small formations, the cold-resisting effect was much stronger, and they could block out the wind and raise the temperature to an almost normal level. Their small range meant that these formations did not affect the large formation. They also allowed the soldiers of the Great Tang to enjoy piping hot food. As for the Alliance soldiers, granting them a lamb leg was already good enough. Wang Chong naturally wouldn't take the pains to do anything else for them. Outside the walls, the three of them finally picked up that stone-cold lamb leg. It was better to have than not have. The ability to eat this sort of delicious lamb leg was already an enormous luxury. Hiya! The three turned their horses around and departed with the lamb leg into the snowstorm. None of them noticed that Wang Chong was watching them leave. Xianxia watched them leave and then spoke, putting down the piece of lamb he was eating. Your Highness, will this really work on them? Isn't this too intentional? The three Alliance scouts had not run into a Tang feast by coincidence. Everything had been part of the plan. Though the Alliance was somewhat weaker than the Great Tang, it was not lacking for intelligent strategists. It would be difficult for their motives behind all this to remain hidden. In strategy, there are hidden schemes and open schemes, frontal soldiers and surprise soldiers. We are currently employing an open scheme. It doesn't matter if they realize our motives. What is important is what they see and what they think. Wang Chong casually chuckled. While the Alliance, with Genesis Supreme's help, doesn't need to worry about the cold for now, neither the Eastern Turks, the Shi, nor the Khitans have a practice of storing food. As for Goguryeo, its lands are barren, and this cold wave came very suddenly. Even if they stored food, it wouldn't be much. With Yuzhou, their supplies were provided by the imperial court, so there is no way they could have much extra food. Rationing of food is inevitable. It's already good enough that the alliance can feed all of its troops. There's no way it can freely hold a feast. The Great Tang has abundant resources. It's enough for them to see this. Wang Chong had a face of supreme confidence, acting as if he had seen through everything. But this will mean that our supplies are exhausted ahead of time, which will disadvantage us in the future. Xianxia hesitantly said. The amount of food consumed by the army each day, and how long the supplies would last, had all been calculated ahead of time. While they had suffered heavy losses in the last battle, there were still 700,000 to 800,000 soldiers in the fortress. With this many soldiers, food was no small problem. Moreover, for this feast, the amount of meat and food being consumed was 10 times more than usual, which was no small number. With the cold wave around them, Xianxia couldn't help but be worried. Your Highness, why don't we do it in rounds? Once today's feast is done, we can return to normal for a few days. In any case, the effect has already been achieved. Xianxia probed. Usually, feasts would only be held if the army was victorious, but Wang Chong had arranged for there to be a feast not just today, but tomorrow, the day after that, and for the next 10 days. The food consumed by 700,000 to 800,000 people was no small amount. Xianxia's words did not represent his own stance, but the stance of others as well. After all, with ice and snow covering the land, there was almost no place on the continent that could produce food. Wang Chong waved his hands and indifferently said, "There's no need. Continue as I have ordered. With regards to the food for the feast, not only are we not decreasing it, we must increase the amount with each passing day." Ah! Xianxia called out in alarm, his eyes flying open. The surrounding soldiers also looked over, and the quartermasters found it difficult to conceal their shock. They were responsible for arranging the food for the feast, but Wang Chong had never mentioned increasing the scale of the feast. As if understanding what they all thought, Wang Chong sternly said, "War is the art of deception. All you need to remember is that our goal in this war is not to defeat the cold, nor is it to withstand the cold wave, but to defeat Lushan and the Alliance army. When we defeat our foe is when we can return to the capital. This is what is most important." Seeing the stern expression on his face, all of them instantly lowered their heads. "Yes, Your Highness." Wang Chong's words had made all of them realize that they had been going down the wrong path. It was true. The goal of this war was not to save food, but to defeat the Alliance army as quickly as possible. "Come, a toast." Putting them aside, Wang Chong raised his cup filled with high-class wine from the capital and spoke to the numerous soldiers within the fortress. The soldiers raised their cups and loudly replied, "To His Highness!" The cheers resounded through the city, shaking the heavens. One group of scouts came after another, and the news that the Tang were feasting in the fortress rapidly spread through the Alliance ranks. Moreover, the scouting teams had brought back roast lamb legs, roast pig, leather bags filled with wine, and even various pastries the Tang liked to eat. The news about what their foes were up to spread through the Alliance soldiers like the plague. The cheerful laughter and sounds of celebration left all the Alliance soldiers with very mixed feelings. The battlefield was known to be hell on earth, a meat grinder for soldiers. Even though the soldiers could freely breathe and were currently uninjured, no one knew if they would come back alive from the next battlefield. Everyone had grown accustomed to the battlefield being cold, cruel, and arduous, so it was easy to understand what they felt when they saw the Tang happily feasting away. In the Alliance camp, a Yuzhou scout kneeled and respectfully said, "Master, the Tang in the steel fortress show no signs of stopping their celebration." Thud! A plump palm slammed against a table, causing even the ground beneath it to tremble. "Bastard! This is already the 7th day. What is that bastard thinking?" And Lushan's beard trembled as he raged. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, the Great Tang celebration seemed to have no end, even though he knew that Wang Chong didn't have good intentions. and Lushan had to admit that the activity to their south had already begun to affect his army's morale. While in Lushan raged, Cui Chenyu, Tian Shenzhen, and Tian Qingxi frowned. They understood Wang Chang's intentions, but they didn't know what to do. They had already discussed whether or not they could imitate the Great Tang and hold their own feast, but Gao Shang had quickly rejected the idea. The reason the alliance had been able to remain so calm and free of quarrels was that they were independent of each other and respected each other. Other than when they fought, they basically kept to themselves. If they wanted to feast as the Tang did, who would provide the food for the feast? Goguryeo didn't raise much livestock, so they would have to depend on the Eastern Turks and Khitans. But would the Eastern Turks and Khitans be willing? Moreover, the countries had different eating customs, so if this matter were done poorly, it would fail to calm the army's morale and also stir up conflict between the countries, doing the opposite of what they hoped. At this moment, a familiar voice said, "Heh, just a few small matters. Is there any need for Lord Protector General to be concerned?" Everyone turned to the speaker. The tent flap was raised, and a familiar figure wearing a black robe entered the tent. The Divine Works Elder? Everyone was rather surprised to see this visitor. "Elder, welcome." And Lushan quickly got up, brought his hands together, and bowed, his expression extremely courteous. "Cui Chenyu, order some men to warm up some wine and bring it over." "Hee, that's not necessary, as I'm just passing by. Just get me a seat." The Divine Works Elder said lightly, waving his hand. He was quite satisfied with Lushan's attitude. In truth, he hadn't been very friendly to Lushan when he first arrived at Yuzhou. The man was a mere mortal, someone that was being used by the organization. But over these last few days, Lushan had gone on a charm offensive, giving him all sorts of gifts. Ever since Genesis Supreme's descent, Lushan had been more courteous to him than even to Genesis Supreme. The Divine Works Elder normally didn't receive much attention in the organization, almost not existing. And Lushan's efforts immediately pushed his self-respect to the very maximum. The Divine Works Elder raised his head and proudly said, "It's just some ants celebrating before their deaths. So why should Lord Protector General be concerned? Once Lord Protector General rules the world and becomes its master, you will realize that this Wang Chong is nothing at all." And Lushan bowed and respectfully said, "I will take Elder's auspicious words to heart. If there really is such a day, Elder will undoubtedly have played a major role. And Lushan will not forget Elder's efforts." The mighty Protector General of Yuzhou, the supreme commander of the alliance, was being so meek to the Divine Works Elder, even flattering him. If outsiders saw this, they would find it very hard to believe their eyes. But Cui Chenyu and Tian Shenzhen were totally unperturbed, as if they had seen nothing at all. The two of them were no stranger to Lushan's way of doing things. This was how Lushan had treated Zhang Shogui long ago. They knew their master was someone who did not strike unless he was sure of success. For him to suddenly fawn like this meant that he was seeking something. "Then I won't be polite. Once Lord Protector General conquers the world, you may fulfill this promise you made to this old man." The Divine Works Elder stroked his beard, a look of pride on his face. And Lushan quickly exchanged glances with his subordinates, all of them with understanding smiles on their lips. An old monster like the Divine Works Elder who had lived for ages and possessed so much knowledge was basically a moving treasury. They had believed that it would be very difficult to make friends with this old monster, but to their surprise, this man had a very strong desire for power. Not the authority wielded by a schemer behind the shadows, but power that everyone could see. Yes, the Divine Works Elder wanted authority over a dynasty. And Lushan had promised him that once he conquered the world, he would establish a world dynasty where the Divine Works Elder would be the Minister of Works. In addition, the Divine Works Elder had demanded authority above the Prime Minister. He did not need to attend court, but he could kill as he pleased, and not even Lushan would be able to order him around. And Lushan had agreed to everything. For Lushan, this sort of person was a rare commodity that he needed to corner. If he could recruit the Divine Works Elder to remain at his side, it would be a great aid to him in the future. More importantly, they could use the Divine Works Elder to find out secrets of the Celestial God Organization. Genesis Supreme and his ilk were far too powerful. And Lushan had not started his revolt so that he could be a puppet emperor. Naturally, what An Lushan has promised and Lushan will do. To attend on Elder is in Lushan's honor. And Lushan said, his expression brimming with sincerity. The Divine Works Elder gave a satisfied nod. Extremely happy with An Lushan's attitude. The Divine Works Elder sat where An Lushan had been sitting, sipped from the tea on the table and casually said, "Didn't you ask me how Venerable Genesis Supreme was so certain that he could break the walls of the steel fortress?" Venerable Genesis Supreme was present at the time, so I couldn't speak, but telling you now will be of no harm. I don't know where that boy in the south learned how to build this kind of steel fortress, but so long as the inscriptions and formations he learned were based on what we passed down, we will definitely have a way to deal with it. The Divine Works Elder didn't keep up the suspense. He extended a shriveled hand out of his sleeve and opened his palm, revealing a flattened metal tip. What is this? Everyone was flabbergasted by the object in the Divine Works Elder's hand. Was the Divine Works Elder saying that this thing could destroy the steel fortress to the south? This divine craft arrow is something from a lost civilization. I thought that the organization had melted all of them, but I still managed to find one. Venerable Genesis Supreme has decided to act in a few days precisely because he has gone to fetch more of these divine craft arrows. The Divine Works Elder proudly said. He looked at the flattened metal tip in his hand like it was some unique treasure. And Lushan glanced at the unremarkable divine craft arrow and dubiously said, "This thing can break the walls? Heh, don't look down on it. This specially crafted bolt is the sharpest thing in the world, even more formidable than the Tang ballista bolts. This bolt has a special inscription that can pierce through all the defensive inscriptions and formations in the world. Can even easily pierce through the Great Tang's formidable fortress. The only pity is that the method for producing this bolt has been lost, so each bolt used is lost forever. They are extremely valuable." The Divine Works Elder lovingly fondled the bolt as he spoke. "Once the battle begins, we simply need to fire the bolts into the wall, and taking the city will be much easier. In front of this bolt, the Tang fortress is nothing at all." So this was the case, and Lushan looked at the bolt in the Divine Works Elder's hand and frowned. "Hee. Don't believe me?" The Divine Works Elder grinned. He took the bolt and lightly scraped it across the metal table in front of him, instantly gouging out a scar more than half an inch deep in the refined iron. Everyone was stunned by this, and Lushan always gave himself the finest things. While this iron table seemed ordinary, it was actually incredibly dense. Even precious swords would barely leave a mark on it. But a casual scrape from the Divine Works Elder's bolt had such an enormous effect. One could easily tell how sharp it was. It truly isn't bad. With these things, taking the city will be much easier. And Lushan took the bolt from the Divine Works Elder's hand, examined it for a while, and then nodded. His judgment was correct. The Divine Works Elder truly did possess many fine things. But Venerable Genesis Supreme cannot be so certain merely because of these divine craft arrows. Yes? And Lushan sternly said. While this bolt was very good, it still wasn't enough. And Lushan had been with Genesis Supreme for some time and had some understanding of him. The Tang were not weak, particularly their commander that these people called the Child of Destruction. Genesis Supreme had to have something else that he was relying on. Haha, of course. Venerable Genesis Supreme's methods are not something people like you can imagine. While this Great Tang seems extremely powerful to you, in our eyes, it is just an ordinary dynasty. The Divine Works Elder smugly replied, and Lushan and his generals were stunned. They exchanged glances but said nothing more. An empire that could contend against all the other countries was just an ordinary dynasty to the Divine Works Elder. If so, then how strong was a true dynasty in their eyes? Was it as those men in black always said, that all empires and dynasties were merely ants in their eyes? Genesis Supreme, the Divine Works Elder, and their comrades had far too many disconcerting secrets. The Divine Works Elder continued to speak. That boy truly does have some ability. This is the first time I've ever seen Venerable Genesis Supreme with such a headache. However, He has also succeeded in stimulating Venerable Genesis Supreme's rage. The battle will be starting soon. Yes? Relax. Everything has been prepared and readied. Soon, the entire steel fortress will collapse. This war will not be as difficult and complicated as you think. The Divine Works Elder smiled. And Lushan wanted to ask more, but at this time, urgent footsteps came from outside. Reporting. A Yuzhou soldier rushed inside and got down on one knee. Master, Venerable Genesis Supreme has ordered for the city to be attacked tomorrow and requests your presence. Bang! The messenger's words made everyone tremble in shock and look over in unison. The battle is finally beginning. So fast. The group quickly departed. Rumble. War drums began to thunder. After a pause of tensome days, the clouds of war were once more gathering over Yuzhou, and the atmosphere in the northeast once more turned tense. A day quickly went by. Cree. In the snowstorm, a snow eagle sharply screeched as it turned away from Yuzhou and toward the steel fortress to the south. It's finally starting. On the northern wall of the steel fortress, Wang Chong stood with his hands behind his back, his black hair dancing in the wind. Pass on my order. All soldiers, stand by and prepare for battle. Amidst howling winds, the cold wave surged over the steel fortress and into the distance. At that moment, while Wang Chong stood motionless on the wall, his mind was in turmoil. The last battle had finally come. Ever since his reincarnation, Wang Chong had been constantly participating in various wars. But this war was somewhat different from all the others. And Lushan, it is about time things between us ended, Wang Chong silently remarked. His eyes seemed to pierce through the snowstorm to the alliance camp on the other side. For a long time, his and Lushan's fates had been intertwined as if decided by destiny. One wanted to destroy the Great Tang. The other wanted to protect it. Between the two of them, only one was ever bound to survive. The battle had been on pause for so long that Wang Chong was confident that the alliance assault would be completely different this time. Wang Chong sensed that the battle would not be so protracted this time. Between the two of them, between the Great Tang and the alliance, things would be totally brought to an end. I hope that you won't disappoint me. Wang Chong slowly raised his eyes to the skies. The Celestial God Organization, Genesis Supreme, and Lushan, the Yelyuo, the otherworldly invaders. Countless thoughts passed through Wang Chong's mind. In his last life, Wang Chong and everyone else knew that Lushan had summoned the otherworldly invaders, but nobody knew how he had summoned them, why he could summon them, or what the otherworldly invaders were. Even at the time of the apocalypse, nobody knew about these things. But now that he had been reborn, Wang Chong suddenly had a feeling. In his last life, although he had been made the Supreme Marshal in the apocalypse and led the remaining soldiers of the Great Tang in campaigns across the realm, he had been so busy fighting that there had been many things that he had not been clear about. Perhaps it was better to say that he didn't have the leisure to understand these things, as he had far too many things to be concerned about. He had been like a boat on the ocean that was full of leaks. There were far too many holes to patch, but repairing any hole was essentially useless. But in this life, things were different. When a stone dropped into water and stirred countless ripples, it would also stir up the truth lurking beneath the surface. For the first time, Wang Chong felt like he was getting close to the core secrets from his last life. He was verging on an explanation for the truth of the calamity that was completely different from what it was in his last life. His actions in this life had caused some things to slowly emerge from the waters. This was particularly true with the Yelyuo, these things that should have never appeared. Though they were incomplete, Wang Chong sensed that the Yelyuo were even stronger than the complete otherworldly invaders in some aspects. At the very least, these Yelyuo did not have some of the flaws and weaknesses the otherworldly invaders had possessed in his last life. In addition, these Yelyuo had clearly been constructed through use of particular otherworldly invaders, and not ordinary otherworldly invaders. Wang Chong had a keen understanding of otherworldly invaders, and he could tell that they were actually divided into different levels. These Yelyuo were clearly constructed from higher-level, otherworldly invaders. What was the Celestial God Organization? How had they been able to obtain these otherworldly invaders? Why did they not use real otherworldly invaders? Did they really create these Yelluo to help in Lushan? What was the truth? Wang Chong had far too many questions. Regardless, the Celestial God organization had an inextricable connection with the apocalyptic calamity. In this life, he had to find an answer and make the people guiding these events from behind the curtain pay a price. Whoosh! A cold gust of wind blew past as Wang Chong turned around and slowly disappeared into the snowstorm. With the clouds of war stirring, both the Steel Fortress and the Alliance camp became much quieter. Even the number of scouts had decreased. But the tension continued to rise. On the wall, Su Kai, standing next to Xianxia, suddenly turned his head and asked, "How is it? Any signs of movement?" His voice was tinged with unease and concern. Upon hearing Su Kai's question, Chun Burang and Sun Jiming also turned to look. Yu Zhou was preparing to attack, and from a distance, they could hear the pounding of drums carried by the wind. They had believed that the alliance would start moving at around daybreak, but it was now noon, and there was still no sign of movement from Yu Zhou. This was far too strange. None. I've checked several times, but the alliance has shown no sign of movement. However, it's true that they are preparing for battle, Xianxia said, his brow creasing in confusion. The battles the Great Tang had fought before had been extremely protracted, fought from daybreak until nightfall. No one would intentionally delay, because both sides in this battle were anxious to go on the offensive. All of them wanted to defeat their foe as quickly as possible and obtain victory. Yet though the alliance had blown the horns and pounded the drums, all signs showing that they were preparing to attack, they still had not moved. This was incredibly suspicious. "What has His Highness said?" Sun Jiming asked. "Wait. There's nothing else to do but wait. We aren't Yuzhou soldiers, who can resist the cold and wind with the power of the Yelluo. The formation only covers the Steel Fortress. If we go out to fight, our strength will plunge," Xianxia sternly said. Xianxia had been constantly serving at Wang Chong's side. More than a year ago, when the Little Ice Age had descended, Xianxia had participated in the Battle of Talas. Xianxia remembered the gruesomeness of that battle like it had happened yesterday. The Arabian Empire had commanded so many men, but the vast majority had not been killed by the Great Tang. They had been frozen to death in the blizzard. Once the blizzard had stopped and Xianxia had emerged to take a look, he saw that many people had been frozen into statues along with their horses. With this past example, he knew that leaving the fortress at this point to fight would be extremely unwise. What sort of trick is this in Lushan trying to play? All of them frowned, the same thought emerging in their minds. Finally, as night was about to fall, there was some movement. Cree! A sharp screech came from above, and a large bird plunged out of the snowstorm like a sharp sword and landed on Xianxia's shoulder. At this moment, Xianxia instantly paled. "Someone, report to His Highness at once. Enemy attack." Bong bong bong. A few seconds later, the pounding of war drums broke through the storm. At the same time, the thundering of hooves and neighing of horses grew louder and louder, closer and closer. And Lushan and the Alliance army had finally begun their assault. Boom! A horn blared out from the fortress, and the fortress swiftly entered a battle-ready state. Countless soldiers filed out of their barracks and up to the walls. Gears began to creak and turn. 5 minutes later, the fortress fell silent, its conversion to a war machine complete. Everyone watched as Wang Chong, Wang Zhongxi, Zhangzhou Jianxiong, and Abusi mounted the walls. On the other side of the battlefield, within the snowstorm, was a completely different scene. "Hiya! Nay! All of you, get in there!" In the snowstorm, the pounding of hooves and neighing of horses mixed together with harsh orders and the cracking of whips. In the snow, one could see Eastern Turkic cavalry, Khitan cavalry, Shi cavalry, Gogrian soldiers, and Yuzhou soldiers marching toward the steel fortress. If one were able to look down from the sky, one could see that the Yelluo were scattered throughout the army, gray-white halos beneath their feet. Centered on these Yelluo were significantly dimmer gray-white halos that spread to the rest of the army. The gray-white halos greatly boosted the ability of the army to resist the extreme cold. Moreover, as the army set out, they carried with them round or square copper pearls or cauldrons. These were special ritual tools that Genesis Supreme had brought along, their surfaces covered with mysterious inscriptions. Crimson light like lava spewed out from the depths of these ritual tools, rising more than 300 feet into the air. Invisible energy rippled out from these ritual tools. Within several hundred feet, the snowstorm could not get close. These ritual tools were systematically distributed throughout the army, together creating a mobile formation that covered the entire Alliance army and minimized the effects of the snowstorm on it. Kill, kill, kill. When the battle begins, I want everyone to charge in there. The steel fortress has a large amount of roast pig, roast lamb, beef, chicken. You can eat as much as you want. Once we kill the Tang, all of it will be ours. An Eastern Turkic general cracked his whip to keep the army advancing as he looked at the fortress and savagely shouted. A roast pig with a crispy outside and tender inside, the yellow fat dripping to the ground and sizzling, sprinkled with cumin and salt. Have you eaten this before? None of you have eaten it, but I have. I don't want to eat those rock-like rations anymore. Get out there and kill all the Tang, and all of it will be yours. The Eastern Turkic general's words had everyone's stomachs grumbling and their fingers twitching. The news of the feasts the Tang had been holding over the last few days was known throughout the entire army. For the Alliance army, which had been living a savage life, that food within the fortress held an irresistible allure. Not even jewels and gold held as much temptation. An Eastern Turkic soldier swallowed his saliva and roared, "General, just tell us what to do and who to kill. We'll follow your orders. His Majesty just needs to promise that he'll hold us a feast just like the Tang did once we win." The Eastern Turkic general raised his whip and heartily laughed. "Ha ha! So little imagination. The Tang's main army is here. If we kill all of them, all of the great Tang will be ours. Roast pig, roast lamb, gold and women. It's all yours for the taking." "Many thanks, General." The Eastern Turkic general's words energized all the surrounding soldiers. Similar situations happened amongst the Khitans, Shi, Gogurians, and Yuzhou soldiers. Farther in the rear, and Lushan and Gaoshang were satisfied to see this. They still keenly recalled the feasts the Tang had held over the last few days. Everyone knew what Wang Chang's goal had been. He was flaunting his power in front of the Alliance, mocking the Alliance for being all bark and no bite, for their miserable defeat in the last battle and their failure to even overcome the walls. He was both beating down the Alliance army's morale and raising the Tang army's morale. Two birds with one stone. This matter truly had stirred chaos in the Alliance ranks, but Lushan and Gaoshang had speedily reacted and used the matter to stir the fighting will of their soldiers. If they won in battle, all of the wine and meat the Tang had enjoyed would be used to hold a multi-day feast to celebrate their victory. If Wang Chong wanted to use this low-class method to disrupt the Alliance army, then he was dreaming. Bong bong bong. In the center of the army, hundreds of specially selected elites wielding cudgels pounded on the drums atop rows of war carts, the thunderous booming guiding the army through the snowstorm. And Lushan rode out, and riding with him were Osmish Kagan, Yun Gaesaman, the Khitan king, and the Shi queen. Everyone, victory or defeat will be decided in this battle. And Lushan said, his face determined. In this battle, we will utterly defeat the great Tang. Ha ha, with Venerable Genesis Supreme here, we will definitely defeat the great Tang. Lord Protector General, be at ease. Once we win this battle, we will definitely recommend Lord Protector General to be made the new Tang Emperor. The Khitan king loudly proclaimed. Hee, Brother Wanyan, you can't call him the Tang Emperor. Protector General, and we'll be learning from past dynasties and setting up a new dynasty. Osmish Kagan corrected, smiling. Oh, that was my mistake. The Khitan king slapped himself on the head. Everyone couldn't help but laugh at this. Your Majesties, thank you for the praise, but it is still too early to speak about such things. Our first priority is to take that fortress as soon as possible. And Lushan smiled, his expression unperturbed. Heh, the only thing the Tang can rely on is their walls. Venerable Genesis Supreme has already promised that he will deal with the walls. Once the walls are brought down and they are deprived of the protection of their formation, our soldiers will strike together with your Yeluo. Do you really think this won't be enough to defeat the Tang? Goguryeo Emperor Yun Gaesaman said in his deep and savage voice, faintly smiling. Everyone smiled in understanding. They were so relaxed and confident primarily because of Genesis Supreme's promise. There was no one in the world that could beat the king of foreign lands when it came to using steel in warfare. Whether it was erecting a steel defense line on an open plain or building a fortress in the space of one night, turning a melee into a siege, Wang Chong's methods were truly worth praising. But without these things, the Great Tang's fighting power would drop an entire level. The moment the walls fell, the Tang would be defeated. Reporting. A messenger with a flag on his back swiftly rode over. Master, the front has sent word that they will soon arrive at the steel fortress. Buzz. Everyone trembled in shock and came to their senses. Come on. Let's go and see the Great Tang's king of foreign lands. And Lushan's eyes flashed with cold light as he swiftly advanced. Atop the walls of the fortress, Wang Chong stood like a spear thrust into the ground. His imposing figure had long ago become the backbone of the entire army. Wang Chong's sharp gaze pierced through the howling winds, and his psychic energy rippled outward, keeping constant surveillance on the movement in front of him. It's here, Wang Chong suddenly declared, his brow twitching. As if in response to Wang Chong's voice, thumping hooves came out of the storm. 2,000 to 3,000 figures emerged out of the blizzard, but in the blink of an eye, it became an army of hundreds of thousands. The atmosphere instantly tensed. The battle had finally begun. But at this time, Wang Chong was focused on a certain point in the north, not on the Alliance soldiers before him. Whoosh! The ranks of the Alliance army suddenly parted, and a familiar and rotund figure soon appeared, accompanied by several figures that radiated storms of energy. Though the snow kept him from seeing the man's face, Wang Chong instantly recognized who this was. And Lushan. This was the only person in the world that Wang Chong could recognize purely by seeing the shape of his body. Wang Chong, are you ready? Today will be the day of your death. And Lushan's booming voice was carried by the wind into the fortress. Though he was doing his best to restrain it, when Lushan saw Wang Chong, he couldn't help but unleash some of his immense hatred and killing intent. He had only met Wang Chong a few times, but the two of them had a grudge as deep as the ocean between them. Wang Chong was the person he wanted to kill the most. Foolish clown, with this king here, you will never succeed at anything, Wang Chong coldly said from atop the walls. Whoosh! And Lushan's face instantly turned bright red, seemingly enraged by Wang Chong's words. Wang Chong had not explicitly cursed him in any way, but the casual tone and deep contempt in his voice had been the best provocation. Several years ago, when Wang Chong had pursued him through the capital, he had carried the same contempt in his eyes. But even though Lushan was now the protector general of Yuzhou with an army of millions and the powerful Yeluo on his side, Wang Chong still looked at him with such contempt. Wang Chong, the day I take your head and rip your body to shreds is not far off, and Lushan savagely declared to himself. But Lushan did not say such things in front of the other sovereigns. The mighty war saint still plans to run and hide? Wang Chong, if you're really so formidable, come out of your fortress and fight a decisive battle with my alliance. And Lushan sternly said, war is the art of deception. If both sides simply threw aside their defenses and engaged in a direct clash, what would be the point of strategy? The point of generals? And Lushan, I didn't think that you would still be so naive after becoming Protector General. Wang Chong indifferently said. These words had Lushan fuming from every pore. Wang Chong was clearly mocking his lack of understanding in the art of war. Gao Shang stepped forward and whispered, Master, there's no need to grow angry because of him. Once we take their fortress, Master can vent all your anger at once. When it came to his tongue, Wang Chong also had the caliber of a war saint, and Lushan was far inferior to him in this aspect. Hiss! And Lushan took in a deep breath and calmed himself down. In truth, he wasn't so easily angered. Otherwise, he would have never survived so long serving Zhang Shogui. The only person on the continent who could so infuriate him with just a few words was that bastard. Moreover, Gao Shang was right. Now was truly not the time to be moved to anger. Wang Chong, even when your death is imminent, you still boast so shamelessly. Since that is so, we'll see how you really do on the battlefield. I hope that your several 100,000 soldiers can pass the night." And Lu Shan coldly sneered, and with one last glance at Wang Chong, he turned and left. With one light glance, Wang Chong quickly turned his gaze to a certain spot in the air above the Alliance army. "Genesis Supreme, come out. What's the point in having a puppet fight me? Or do you intend to hide behind the curtains until the end?" These words made Lu Shan so angry that he staggered for a moment, but he restrained himself from turning back. With an angry grunt, he disappeared into the storm. As Lu Shan disappeared, above the Alliance army, a familiar figure in golden divine armor slowly emerged from the void. "What are your last words?" Genesis Supreme's eyes were colder and sharper than the edge of a blade, and his icy voice resounded over the army. "Genesis Supreme, your celestial god organization is truly ruthless. Not only did you create this great cold wave that has sealed the world in ice, you even stirred up internal strife in other countries. And Lu Shan is simply the spokesperson that your lot supported, and your final goal is to bring over those otherworldly invaders. These Yeluo are merely their vanguard. Were you not going to tell them? Did you plan to exploit them until the end?" Upon hearing Wang Chong's words, Genesis Supreme's sharp eyes rippled for a moment, and on the battlefield, the various sovereigns felt their hearts seize up. When two armies faced each other, it was common for both sides to use harsh words to psychologically batter the opposition. But no one had expected Wang Chong to say such things to Genesis Supreme. Celestial God Organization? This was where Genesis Supreme and those men in black came from. And also, since they had the ability to resist the cold wave on a large scale, perhaps this calamity that had sealed the world in ice really was their doing. Not only that, these Yeluo were basically impossible to kill unless one wounded their heads. They were in complete defiance of common sense. The sovereigns weren't fools, and with all the time they had spent with the Yeluo and the Yuzhou soldiers, they had not been completely clueless. Though they could not rule out Wang Chong using this method to stir internal strife, this did not mean that the Great Tang's war saint was lying. The only problem was, what were those otherworldly invaders Wang Chong spoke of? Everyone's eyes turned strange. And Lu Shan and Gao Shang sensed this shift, and they couldn't help but deeply frown. "Did you ask for this god just to say this? If those are your final words, this god has no interest in listening. In addition, in this battle you will not have any formation to use. Tonight, neither you nor the Tang soldiers you have brought will be leaving this place." Genesis Supreme's indifferent voice rang out in everyone's ears, and with one last glance at Wang Chong, he disappeared like a ghost. Boom! A plaintive horn blared, penetrating through the snowstorm. The Alliance was finally ready to begin its attack. On the wall, Wang Chong remained motionless, his hair dancing in the wind. "Little nightmare, the Alliance has come prepared. This is a vital battle, so I leave it to you." Wang Chong spoke in an almost inaudible whisper that only he could hear. All was quiet, but a few moments later, a familiar voice rang out in Wang Chong's mind. "Master, be at ease. I have already attached my psychic energy to Genesis Supreme. Genesis Supreme's attention is on Master, and he has yet to notice. In addition, Genesis Supreme has only recently obtained this body and has yet to fully synchronize with it. I can sense that there are several flaws in him. Otherwise, it would not have been so easy for me to attach my psychic energy to him. But I still need some time to confirm this." If Genesis Supreme had heard this mental conversation with the Nightmare Beast, he would have undoubtedly been shaken. In the battle before the Cold Wave, he had fought with Wang Chong, but the Nightmare Beast had never intervened. Genesis Supreme would have never imagined that it was then that the Nightmare Beast planted something on his body. And while Wang Chong had spoken about the otherworldly invaders and his deception of the Alliance in that conversation just now, that had not been his true goal at all. It had apparently been to confirm something. I will create an opportunity for you." Wang Chong nodded. A messenger's voice came from behind him. "Your Highness, the Alliance is about to attack. Lord Junior Guardian and the other great generals have sent subordinates to ask for the next step." Wang Chong waved his hand and calmly said, "Pass on my order." Prepare for battle. Yes. The messenger quickly departed. Bong bong bong. A few moments later, the thunderous rumbling of war drums came out of the snowstorm. Wang Chong stood on the wall, and through the snowstorm, he could see enormous silhouettes rumbling toward the fortress. If all went as expected, this second battle between the Great Tang and the Alliance would still be opened by the shield carts. However, these shield carts had clearly been modified compared to the first battle. The frontal steel plates of the shield carts flowed with light, a clear indication that they had been reinforced with many more inscriptions and formations. And behind the shield carts, special silhouettes instantly drew Wang Chong's attention. These were the callous Yeluo, with gray-white halos beneath their feet. The several thousand shield carts moved forward in a row, and behind each shield cart was a Yeluo. They planned to use the shield carts to cover the Yeluo. Wang Chong's eyes flashed in understanding. In the earlier battle, Wang Chong's Wuxian cavalry had suffered unprecedented losses, but the Yeluo had also paid a heavy price. Though 20,000 some Yeluo still remained, this was still an enormous loss. The shield carts were meant to protect the Yeluo from having their heads shot off by the concentrated fire of Tang ballistae. It was also so that their gray-white halos could continue to confer the extremely powerful cold resistance to the army. Wang Chong scanned the area and quickly settled his gaze on one of the Yeluo. At that moment, Wang Chong slightly frowned. These Yeluo were clearly much stronger than they had been in the previous battle. Their absorbing energy from the cold wave, Wang Chong suddenly realized. Bzzz. As he closed and opened his eyes, the world before him changed. True world. Wang Chong used this ability without hesitation, and upon doing so, he saw countless slivers of energy connected to the bodies of the Yeluo. The power of the cold wave was carried along these invisible lines into the bodies of the Yeluo, constantly strengthening them. Wang Chong's heart instantly sank. The Yeluo in this cold wave were like fish in the water. Their strength had already been frightening, and now that they had a constant source of energy in the cold, they would become even stronger. This was foul news for the Great Tang. But after taking a deep breath, Wang Chong calmed down. Wang Chong was not prepared to fight a field battle within Lushan this time. While the Yeluo's powers had been greatly increased, they were powerless against the soaring walls of the fortress. As cavalry, no matter how strong the Yeluo were, they could not utilize their advantages in a city assault. Boom! The blaring of horns and pounding of drums grew louder and louder. More and more Alliance soldiers advanced out of the snowstorm and appeared within vision. Everyone, prepare for battle, Wang Chong grimly ordered. Bang! Once the Alliance army had advanced to a certain point, the countless master archers behind Wang Chong knocked their arrows. Bowstrings creaked, and a moment later, countless armor-piercing arrows flew out. Thud thud thud. Numerous Alliance soldiers dropped to the ground. The shield carts could defend against frontal attacks from ballistae, but not against the volleys of master archers. Everyone, advance at full speed. Orders shouted in Turkic could be heard through the storm. The volleys of the Tang master archers were completely incapable of stopping the Alliance army, and the number of people slain was insignificant to the overall army. Moreover, the Great Tang was firing against the wind. The raging snowstorm served as a barrier that prevented their losses from being as bad as expected. Within the fortress, after the first volley was fired, farther in the rear, an order was shouted. Release! Boom boom boom. There were several thunderous booms, and then silence. But a few moments later, with deafening rumbles, large stones plunged from the sky, covered in thick layers of frost, and crashed into the Alliance army. Boom! 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 Screams rose from the Alliance ranks as the boulders tossed by the catapults struck numerous soldiers. But just like with the volley of arrows, after taking this attack, the Alliance ranks rippled like a lake stirred by a gust of wind, and after a few seconds, everything calmed back down as if nothing had happened at all. With an extremely cold and calm manner, the Alliance army firmly advanced toward the Great Tang. No matter what happened, nothing could stop them. Atop the walls of the steel fortress, the Tang army engaged in volleys of attacks in a cold and rational manner. The master archers and the catapults continued to alternate, and even though their attacks did not affect the advance of the army, they continued to maintain their firing rate. Wang Chong had been observing the alliance armies advance this whole time, and when they had reached a distance of 3,000 feet, he suddenly gave an order. Pass on my orders to the City Defense Division. Have them prepare for the second phase. Thud thud thud. The soldiers of the City Defense Division swiftly came forward and began to push metal caltrops from the wall, immediately creating a new defense line beneath the walls. An attack on the city had to start from the base of the walls. Laying down caltrops at the base of the walls would serve as a major hindrance to the alliance while also covering the offensives from his own side. It was only a matter of moments before the steel caltrops had all been laid down. King of foreign lands, all teams have finished their work. Amidst howling winds, a voice spoke up. At some point, Zhangqiu Jianxiong, Wang Zhongxi, and Zhang Shogui had stepped up to the walls. Thank you for your trouble. Wang Chong nodded without turning his head. All preparations are complete. Victory or defeat will be decided tonight. The highest military commanders of the empire watched from the walls as the alliance army continued its determined advance, and each person felt something strange in the air. The distance was growing smaller and smaller. 2,000 feet. 1,000 feet. Kyle! With frenzied war cries, countless alliance soldiers accelerated toward the steel fortress. The howling winds made their roars even louder. Thud thud thud. At a distance of around 800 feet, the advancing alliance army finally showed movement. In the army, rows of soldiers holding square mechanisms in their hands pointed them at the walls. As gears clacked, short arrow bolts exploded out of the mechanisms and struck the walls. These bolts were unbelievably sharp, and few moments later, those short bolts had penetrated into the walls in a systematic pattern. Upon seeing this, the soldiers on the walls paled. What sort of bolts are these? How could they be so sharp? Before the war, some of the bored soldiers in the fortress had tried hacking at the walls, but all of them had had a hard time leaving behind any marks on the steel. The toughness of these walls was simply incredible. This was why they were so confident in these walls. But those unremarkable arrow bolts were terrifying to behold, easily piercing through the tough steel walls. Go! Before anyone could react, nimble soldiers in the alliance ranks lunged toward the walls. They moved so quickly that it took only a few moments for them to reach the base of the walls. Like monkeys, they began to scale the walls, at the same time fitting specially designed metal plates onto the bolts. Stop them! Even the slowest of the soldiers on the walls began to understand that these bolts had not been misfired. Rather, the Alliance army was using this method to create a path on the smooth walls. With these things, it would be much easier for the Alliance army to reach the top of the walls. Thwish thwish thwish. A portion of the Tang Master Archers changed targets, taking aim at the agile Alliance experts down below and those soldiers carrying the mechanisms that launched those short arrow bolts. Plush! 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 The nimble Alliance experts failed to dodge and were quickly cut down by arrows. But even more experts came out from the rear and rushed to the walls to constantly install more metal plates. In the distance, the Alliance soldiers with the firing mechanisms hid away like turtles, using the metallic, rectangular mechanisms in front of them as shelter from the volley of arrows. With a metallic clang, the vast majority of the arrows were blocked. Rumble! Another wave stirred before the first had time to settle. The ground began to tremble as the Alliance ranks parted, allowing a giant silhouette like a prehistoric beast to slowly come forward. Siege towers. These siege weapons that had been built specifically for this war had once more appeared on the battlefield. Compared to last time, the siege towers had a much easier time advancing. The darkness and the snowstorm provided a double layer of protection that greatly reduced the number of attacks the siege towers faced. Shoot! With a boom, a thick hook shot out from the top of the siege tower toward the top of the walls. As the metal cables tightened, two paths instantly appeared in the air. Kill! Warhorses thundered as countless soldiers surged toward the steel fortress. There were no probes or skirmishes this time. At the very outset of the battle, the Alliance had launched a fierce assault, and waves of soldiers surged forward endlessly. Wang Chong stood on the wall, watching the Alliance soldiers sweep forward with a confident expression. At this point, Wang Chong had many fierce generals under his command. Many things no longer required his personal intervention. As the alliance army began its offensive, order after order was issued as numerous Tang generals faithfully executed the plan that Wang Chong had decided on earlier. Countless attacks poured down from the walls. While charging at the walls, countless alliance soldiers were cut down. Wang Chong was completely unperturbed as he watched. In the first battle, when they had been fighting in the open field, the alliance had a slim chance of defeating the Great Tang. But in a city defense battle, the Tang were famous for fighting such battles. An ordinary general could rely on sturdy walls to resist stronger foes, and when Wang Chong was in a fortress, no one in the world would be able to breach it. These frenzied attacks were simply suicidal in Wang Chong's eyes. Hee. It seems that our foe is very proud. At this moment, a soft chuckle came from the alliance army. The She Queen wore a suit of armor, appearing heroic and valiant. Her eyes were focused on Wang Chong atop the walls, taking in every shift on his face. It's my turn to make a move. Otherwise, we won't be able to do anything to him. As the She Queen spoke, she made her horse trot forward, her intentions obvious. The others smiled. It was said that the women in the She tribe admired warriors that were stronger than them, and it seemed that the She Queen had eyes for the king of foreign lands. Then I leave it to your majesty. And Lushan smiled and didn't try to stop her. The She Queen's abilities were extremely useful in city assaults like this. If Lord Protector General says this lowly woman must do her best. The She Queen said no more. Her smile faded as she slapped the back of her horse and shot toward the walls of the steel fortress. When she was around 2,000 feet away, the She Queen smiled, made her horse stop, and activated her powerful ice element ability. Ancient Glacier. Boom! Her surroundings shuddered, and the snow falling around her suddenly froze in place. The winds began to howl as the boundless energy of the cold wave began to converge on the She Queen. The She Queen's body groaned as her energy levels soared. The Yeluo were not the only ones to benefit from the frigid weather of the cold wave. So did powerful ice element experts like the She Queen. The She Queen was the only female sovereign in the alliance, and she was also the weakest. But not even the She Queen had imagined that she would benefit from the cold wave. Not only had she broken through a threshold and reached a new level, her ice element abilities had also evolved to a higher level. Ancient Glacier was a supreme technique recorded in the texts of the She tribe. Only the She Queens could cultivate this technique, but because it was so difficult to cultivate, no one had succeeded in the last several hundred years. But with the power of the cold wave, the She Queen had done what numerous predecessors could not and once more brought this supreme ice element ability into reality. Rumble. Following the She Queen's will, the wild snowstorm stirred, and several dozen glaciers that were tens of thousands of feet long and several thousand feet wide appeared in the air. Before anyone could react, these enormous glaciers descended while also turning from illusion into reality. With a great boom, the several dozen glaciers appeared on the battlefield. One end of the glaciers was linked to the top of the walls while the other end extended deep into the Alliance army. Moreover, the She Queen had willed it so that countless steps had appeared on the ancient glaciers, making it easier for warhorses to charge up them. Bang! The sight of those enormous glaciers immediately silenced the battlefield. But after that brief moment of silence, an enormous cheer exploded from the Alliance army. The abilities of the She Queen were many times stronger than they had been in the first battle, and everyone was stunned by this power. Even the distant and Lushan couldn't help but widen his eyes in shock at the She Queen's power. Incredible! I truly underestimated this woman, the Khitan king muttered. Next to him, Yun Gaisaman and Osmish Kagan said nothing, but they almost imperceptibly nodded. The rest of the countries in the alliance had always somewhat looked down on the She Queen, but the ability she had displayed here exceeded their own and made everyone take a new look at her. Humph! The She Queen's face was glowing with pride after her feat. What are you waiting for? Hurry up and attack. Bang! Cheers came from all around as countless warhorses began to charge onto the glaciers. The She Queen quickly turned and gave Wang Chong a challenging look. Aren't you looking down on our alliance? Did you think your victory was inevitable? Let's see what you do now. As the Alliance army charged out, the mood on the walls turned grim. Those ice bridges that were as tough as steel made Xianxia Jianxiong and the others scowl. This She Queen is a big problem. Xianxia Jianxiong frowned. He had heard about the She Queen's abilities, but he had come to the battle too late to see with his own eyes, so he had not thought much about it. But now that he did see these shocking ice element abilities that nullified the barrier of the steel walls, Xianxia Jianxiong couldn't help but be worried. I'll go with Brother Xianxia and take care of these glaciers. Crown Prince's junior guardian Wang Zhongxi suddenly proposed. The She Queen had been the greatest beneficiary of the cold wave. Wang Zhongxi had the highest cultivation level, so he had the sharpest senses. He could tell that these ice bridges were extremely dense and would be very difficult for ordinary people to destroy. Only great generals like him and Xianxia Jianxiong could deal with it. While this was somewhat troublesome and time-consuming, it was the best solution. There's no need. I'll deal with this She Queen, Wang Chong indifferently said without turning his head. Everyone was taken aback, but before they could react, with light footsteps, a figure that seemed very similar to Wang Chong but had a different kind of energy emerged in everyone's senses. Turning around, they saw a second Wang Chong slowly step onto the walls. Some minor schemes that aren't worth worrying about, Divine Embryo 3 said as it came forward. The group was taken aback, but then they sensed Divine Embryo 3's icy aura and immediately relaxed. The She Queen was not the only one who had benefited from the cold wave. At the same time, the She Queen slightly frowned upon spotting the second Wang Chong. What is this fellow up to? The She Queen's heart sank. She had some understanding of Wang Chong's clones, but as she had never fought with them, her understanding was fairly limited. Divine Embryo 3 took the stage, speaking little as it looked around at the several dozen ancient glaciers and the numerous Alliance soldiers charging across them. Took a step into the air, slowly raised an arm, and took aim at one of the ancient glaciers. Collapse! Extinguish! Divine Embryo 3 spoke only 2 words, and as the She Queen and countless people stared in shock, a destructive energy erupted from within the several dozen glaciers. This destructive energy was as fierce as a flame, and in a flash, it annihilated the internal structure of the glaciers. Boom! Several dozen of the resplendent and enormous ancient glaciers immediately collapsed into shards and slabs of ice that rained down from the heavens. Ah! At the same time, the Alliance cavalry that had charged up the glaciers screamed as they fell. The battlefield was thrown into disarray, and everyone was struck dumb by what they had just witnessed. Bastard! The She Queen was so infuriated that her body was shaking. She had never imagined that the supreme technique of the She tribe that she had unleashed with all her power would be so easily destroyed. I don't believe that I can't beat you. The She Queen clenched her silver teeth and instantly used the ice element ability once more. Ancient glacier! The She Queen bellowed. A moment later, the energy of the cold wave converged once more, and illusory ancient glaciers appeared again, even more numerous and resplendent than the first. Seeking death. At this time, a cold and callous snort rang out in the She Queen's ears. Before she could react, boom! One of the manifesting glaciers was disrupted by law energy of a completely different nature and obliterated. And as the ancient glacier collapsed, the She Queen trembled, sensing that some incredibly dangerous being had turned its attention on her. Delish! At this time, she heard a piercing whistle. The She Queen opened her eyes and saw a golden arrow howling through the snowstorm at her. When she first saw it, this arrow was still several hundred feet away, but in the time it took for the She Queen to blink, it was right in front of her face. Not good. The She Queen turned ghastly pale. She was no stranger to this arrow. Chuluwu had unleashed a similar arrow against her in the first battle, but comparing this arrow to that one was like comparing the heavens to the earth. This arrow was moving far too fast. By the time the She Queen wanted to dodge, it was too late. It's over. I can't dodge. The She Queen trembled as despair appeared in her eyes. Bang! The She Queen closed her eyes and waited for death. But suddenly, an enormous stream of concentrated energy shot out and blasted away the golden arrow. Enough! Withdraw. With your current level of strength, You're no match for him. At some point, Genesis Supreme had appeared in the air, wearing his divine armor. The She-Queen sighed in relief upon seeing Genesis Supreme. Having escaped certain death, her body instantly became drenched in sweat. My thanks, Venerable Genesis Supreme. The She-Queen gratefully bowed, not daring to remain on the front line. She had always been proud of her ice element abilities, but no matter how proud she was, she could see that there was some gap between her and Wang Chong. Her heart still thumping in fear, the She-Queen turned her horse around and rode away. Genesis Supreme ignored the She-Queen and coldly ordered, "Pass on my order. Mobilize the Divine Aegis Division." Yes. A figure appeared behind Genesis Supreme, bowed, and quickly left. Kyle! The departure of the She-Queen and the fall of those soldiers who had charged up the glaciers did not cause much of a stir, and more soldiers continued to charge forward. Once the orders were given and the plans set, everyone became chess pieces on the board. So long as they did their best to execute their orders, none of the shifts on the battlefield could affect the final result. As the army swept forward in incessant waves, there was one division of soldiers that stood out. This division wore armor that was completely different from that of the other countries. This armor was primarily red and gold, and while some parts appeared rusted, as a whole, the armor was in good condition. Divine Aegis armor. This was the pride of a civilization that Genesis Supreme had personally destroyed many eras ago. This empire was famed for the armor it forged, but its extreme arrogance had ultimately brought disaster down on its head. The stubborn resistance in the northeast and the sharpness of the Tang's arrows had made Genesis Supreme recall the power of this lost civilization. During the break in the war, the Genesis Supreme had gone back to the ruins of that civilization to dig up these suits of armor. At the same time, he selected around 7,000 to 8,000 elites from the Alliance Army and formed a division that specialized in breaking fortified points. Go! At the very front of the Divine Aegis Division, an expert of the Celestial God Organization turned his head and harshly shouted before leading his men climbing up the walls like monkeys. Clang, clang, clang. Chains were tossed onto the walls as the Divine Aegis Division began to push through the attacks from the master archers on the walls and climb. The arrows clinked and clanged as they bounced off their suits of armor. Genesis Supreme watched from above as a Divine Aegis soldier scaled the walls, but he quickly turned his attention to the young figure standing atop the walls. Bang! Wang Chong's hair danced in the wind as he took a step into the air and began to slowly walk over to Genesis Supreme. Genesis Supreme, no matter what you're thinking, it's all pointless. Wang Chong lightly said as he closed the distance, his expression fearless. This was not their first time clashing, but Wang Chong no longer regarded Genesis Supreme with the same attitude. At some point, Wang Chong had already become on par with Genesis Supreme. Humph, you're too immature, having no idea what happens to those who oppose the gods. The Great Tang was too arrogant, Li Tai was too arrogant, and you are too arrogant. And for your arrogance, the Tang Empire will suffer the fate of those empires before it and be totally annihilated. All traces of this empire's existence will be wiped away, and no one will remember the Great Tang, just as no one in the Great Tang knows of those civilizations that came before it. Genesis Supreme callously declared.